The morning broke in shades of grey and wind. The plains stretched endless beneath the dull sky, a sea of brittle grass whispering against itself like the sound of distant memory. Dust rose beneath the hooves of Eli Cartwright's bay gelding, each step slow, measured, heavy with the patience of a man long accustomed to silence. The drought had been unkind this year. Water low, cattle lean, the earth cracked open as if mourning something lost. Eli shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly. His face, weathered and wind-burnt, was carved with the sort of quiet lines that came from living too long with one's own company. His wife had been gone 3 years now. Fever had taken her before winter's thaw, and since then, the ranch had lived in a silence so complete it felt like a second grave. He rode home with supplies, salt, coffee, a new spool of wire, not expecting anything to break the steady rhythm of his loneliness. But halfway down the ridge, where the land dipped toward a dry creek bed, something caught his eye, a flicker of color in the yellow grass. At first he thought it was a deer carcass, maybe a piece of torn fabric caught on brush. Then he saw movement, a small, fragile motion. He dismounted without thought, boots crunching on the parched earth. As he drew near, he saw her, a young woman collapsed in the dust, her dress torn and faded, skin pale beneath the sun's unkind eye. Beside her, a baby lay on a thin quilt, crying so softly it sounded more like a whimper than a wail. Eli froze. The sound pierced through him, through the dust and the years and the hollow quiet of his cabin. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rough from disuse. He crouched beside her. The woman's eyes fluttered open, wide and gray-blue like storm water. "Please," she whispered, lips cracked, breath shallow. "My baby?" He knelt, lifting the infant carefully. A girl no more than a few months old. The child's face was streaked with dust and tears, her hands trembling against the air. Eli took off his coat, wrapping them both in it. The woman tried to rise but fell back with a faint sound of pain. "Don't move," he said softly. "You're safe enough for now." The words felt strange in his mouth. Safe now. They didn't belong to the world they lived in anymore. He carried the woman to his horse, propping her in the saddle before him, the baby nestled between them. It was a slow, uneasy ride home. The clouds hung low, and by the time they reached the ranch, rain had begun to fall, a soft, tentative kind of rain, as if the sky itself feared to disturb the quiet earth. The cabin stood at the edge of a dying grove. Its porch half collapsed, the windows shuddered against the wind. Eli lifted her down, carrying her inside. The warmth from the banked fire met them, faint but steady. He laid her on his late wife's cot and fed the embers with kindling until the flames grew bright enough to cast gold over the wooden walls. She stirred again, eyes flicking toward him. "Where am I?" "Cartwright Ranch," he said, removing his hat. "You passed out a mile west of the creek. How long had you been walking?" Her voice trembled. "Since yesterday. We left the wagon." "The others?" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "There were others once." Eli nodded slowly. He didn't ask more. The West had a way of stripping people down, some to their bones, some to their silence. He poured water from the kettle, handed it to her. "Drink slow." The woman obeyed, then glanced toward her child, who now slept against Eli's coat by the fire. "Her name's Annie," she said softly. "I'm Clara Finch." He nodded again. "Eli." They spoke little after that. The rain deepened, pattering steady on the roof. Clara fed her baby with trembling hands, while Eli repaired a broken stirrup near the hearth, his movements sure and wordless. Every creak of leather, every hiss of rain filled the space between them. The cabin, long empty and seemed to breathe again, faintly alive with the scent of smoke and milk and wet earth. When the child had fallen asleep, Clara's eyes wandered over the room, the old tools lined neatly on the wall, the Bible on the mantel, the rocking chair by the fire, still bearing the faded shawl of another woman. Her throat tightened. "You live alone," she said quietly. "Been that way a while." She hesitated, then whispered, "Your wife?" He nodded once, not looking up. "Buried up the hill." Clara lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." "No need," he said. "It's an old sorrow." The words hung there, soft and heavy. She looked toward the baby again, then back to the fire. Her eyes glistened in the light. I didn't think anyone would stop, she said. Out there, no one does. Not anymore. Eli's hands paused over the leather strap. He thought of the trail. How easy it would have been to ride past, to tell himself it wasn't his business. But he had seen that tiny hand reaching from the grass, and something in him, something human and buried deep, had stirred. He rose, tossing another log onto the fire. You'll stay here tonight, he said. I'll fix a bed in the corner. Clara looked up. Just tonight? He hesitated. The rain outside was turning harder, drumming against the tin roof like an old heartbeat. He met her eyes. For as long as you need. She nodded, tears slipping down her face without sound. The baby stirred, murmuring in sleep, and Clara bent to kiss her forehead. Eli sat by the window, watching the rain fall through the lantern light. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The night closed in around them. Two widowed souls. One tiny heartbeat between them, and the long, patient whisper of rain upon the roof. Emotional tone and realization, cold mercy and hesitant survival. Both carry too much loss to trust kindness. Clara realizes that being saved doesn't yet mean being safe. Eli realizes that loneliness has a face again. The days passed like the wind across the plains, slow, steady, full of distance. Each sunrise came pale and quiet, brushing light through the cabin's single window. Clara Finch rose early, her baby nestled close, and tended to small things that felt larger than they were. Boiling coffee, sweeping the hearth, mending the tear in Eli Cartwright's shirts. She did it without being asked, not from obligation, but from the hollow need to feel useful again. The cabin began to breathe. What had once been still as a grave now carried the faint hum of life, the creak of floorboards beneath light steps, the soft rustle of a shawl, the distant cry of a waking child. Eli noticed it in small ways, the scent of clean cloth, the glimmer of firelight in Clara's hair, the soft voice that soothed the baby when storms rolled over the valley. He said little, but his silence shifted. It was no longer the silence of absence. It became something more patient, like the land itself, enduring, waiting, learning how to listen again. Eli spent his days out on the range, checking the fence line, oiling tools, mending what winter had broken. Often he'd find himself pausing halfway down a ridge, gazing toward the far hill where his wife, Mary, was buried beneath a cottonwood tree. The marker was simple, her name carved into pine, the letters worn by wind. He'd meant to replace it one day, but never had. He thought of her when he saw Clara rocking her baby by the window, humming under her breath. It stirred something deep. Not betrayal, not longing, but the ache of life continuing in a place that had forgotten the sound of it. Clara, for her part, tried not to notice his watching. She felt small in his world, a woman taken in by mercy, not belonging, not yet believing she could. At night, when the wind moaned around the eaves, she would whisper to her child, "We'll move on soon. We mustn't stay where we're not meant to," but the baby, warm and drowsy in her arms, would only breathe softly in reply. One evening, as the sun sank low and gold light spilled across the prairie, Eli returned from town. His horse was lathered, his face dark with something she hadn't seen before. Unease. He hung his hat by the door and stood for a long time without speaking. "Someone asked after you," he said finally. Clara stiffened. "Who?" "Men on the road east of here. Drifters by the look of them. Said a woman named Finch left a trail of debt and trouble behind her." Her hands went cold. The coffee pot trembled as she set it down. "They lie," she whispered. "They always have." Eli didn't answer. The silence stretched thin between them, full of things neither dared to ask. She could see the question flicker in his eyes. Is it true? And she could not bear it. She rose, went to the cradle, lifted her child close. "I'll go," she said quietly. "Tomorrow." "You've done more than enough." He looked at her then. Really looked. At the thinness of her wrists, the weariness in her eyes, the stubborn grace of her standing there in his firelight, ready to walk back into a world that had already broken her once. "You don't owe me anything," he said, voice low. "No," she replied. "But I owe myself the truth." He nodded once, slow, as though accepting a sentence he didn't want spoken. That night, he sat long after she'd gone to bed, the fire sinking to embers. He stared at the empty rocking chair beside him, his wife's chair, and thought about how the world punished women who simply tried to survive. Outside, coyotes sang to the moon, their voices drifting lonely across the plains. At dawn, Clara rose before the light. She packed what little she had, a folded dress, a scrap of bread, the small blanket the baby had been wrapped in the day Eli found them. She tied her hair back in a simple braid, glanced once around the cabin that had, for a short while, felt almost like shelter. Then she opened the door, but something stopped her. Folded neatly over the back of the chair was a shawl, soft, faded rose in color, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. She recognized it from the mantel, where it had lain untouched since her arrival. Clara hesitated. Her throat tightened. She touched the fabric gently, tracing the worn threads. It was a woman's shawl, hand-woven, edges frayed from years of use. When she lifted it, she saw that Eli had mended one corner, a small, careful stitch, newly done. The meaning was clear, unspoken. He wasn't asking her to stay. He was telling her that whatever shame she carried wasn't hers to bear alone. Her breath hitched. The baby stirred against her shoulder. Clara turned, glancing toward the door to the porch, the place Eli had gone each morning to drink his coffee, his eyes always fixed on the horizon. Now the horizon looked softer. She didn't leave that morning. Instead, she sat by the fire, wrapped in the shawl, her baby sleeping in her arms. Eli returned at mid-morning, boots muddy from the fields, and paused in the doorway. Their eyes met. No words, no thanks, just a quiet understanding. He set a sack of flour on the table. "Storm's coming," he said. "Best stay in a while," Clara nodded, a faint smile ghosting across her face. He went about his work and she brewed coffee. The air between them lightened just enough to breathe. As the wind picked up outside, carrying the scent of distant rain, Clara realized something small but sacred. Eli's silence had never been judgment. It had been sorrow, deep and human, the kind that knew how to recognize its own in another. And Eli, glancing toward her as she hummed to the baby, felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared feel since the fever took Mary. Not joy, not yet, but the fragile beginnings of warmth. The ghosts in the house grew quieter that day. Emotional tone and realization, haunting memory and quiet forgiveness. Clara begins to see that Eli's silence isn't judgment, it's sorrow. Eli, for the first time, senses that helping someone might heal him too. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron. The wind picked up across the open plains, bending the grasses until they whispered in uneasy rhythm. Eli Cartwright stood by the corral, the collar of his coat turned up against the coming weather, and watched the clouds build from the west, thick, bruised, and alive with distant lightning. He could smell the storm before it came, sharp and electric, carrying the faint taste of rain and memory. He was just about to head back toward the cabin when he saw the rider. A lone figure moved against the horizon, slow and uncertain. The horse was lathered, dark with sweat, and the man in the saddle rode with the slouched ease of someone who'd traveled too far without rest. When he drew near, Eli noticed the rifle slung low, the dust-caked boots, and the eyes that flicked over everything, assessing, untrusting. "Evenin'," the stranger called over the wind. "Storm's coming hard. Mind if I take cover for a spell?" Eli's grip tightened around the post he leaned against. Strangers rarely came this way, and those who did often carried trouble like a shadow. Still, the code of the plains was older than fear. A man didn't turn another away from shelter in a storm. "Cabins yonder," Eli said. "You can stable your horse in the shed," the man nodded, dismounting. "Much obliged." "Name's Reeve. Cole Reeve." The name hit Clara like a gunshot when she heard it from the doorway. She froze, the baby clutched close, eyes wide with a shock Eli didn't yet understand. Cole's gaze met hers, sharp, unflinching, and for an instant, recognition passed between them like lightning across the sky. "Well," Cole said, his tone low and dry. "Ain't that something? Miss Finch, didn't reckon I'd see you again." Clara's knuckles whitened around the doorframe. "You should have left me buried where you did," she said softly. Eli's eyes narrowed. You two know each other. Cole gave a small, humorless laugh. You could say that. She was with our wagon train. Her man died outside Laramie, and we had to move on, had to? Clara's voice shook, though her eyes burned steady. You left me with no food, no horse, and a fevered baby. You didn't move on. You left me to die. The storm broke then, sudden and violent. Rain hammered the roof as thunder cracked overhead. Eli motioned Cole inside, jaw set. You can speak out of the rain, he said flatly. Inside, the fire threw wild shadows across the walls. The baby began to cry, frightened by the noise. Clara soothed her, though her hands trembled. Cole leaned near the fire, dripping water from his coat, his face half lit by flame. Didn't figure it'd matter, Cole said after a long silence. You were half gone already. And times were lean. Folks had to choose who made it. Clara's voice came out like the edge of glass. And you chose yourself, he shrugged. Most do, Eli's gaze flicked between them. The air in the cabin grew heavy with storm and memory. You best say your piece, he told Cole. Then move on come morning. Cole looked at him, measuring the weight of the man. You don't know what kind of company you keep, Cartwright. There's talk in town, debts, names, the kind that draw men looking to settle scores. Eli's eyes stayed on him, cold and steady. Then they can settle with me, Cole smirked, leaning back against the chair. You'd fight another man's battles? Eli didn't answer. Clara rose, her child quiet now against her shoulder. You came here to hurt me again, she said softly. To drag my name through mud you made. Cole's smile faltered. You think I wanted it this way? You think I didn't see what those men were? They lied, Clara, about you, about your husband. Sold off what was yours, blamed you to keep their hands clean. Her face went pale. You were one of them. I was, he said. And I ain't proud, the wind howled through the eaves. Eli moved closer, every muscle coiled tight. That's enough, he said. Cole rose too, his tone shifting from regret to provocation. You don't know her story, rancher. Don't make the mistake of thinking she's some saint you plucked from the dust. She's got ghosts, same as any of us. Eli stepped forward, his shadow falling long in the firelight. And I reckon she's lived with them long enough. The tension snapped like a breaking rope. Cole swung first, fast, wild, but Eli had fought storms harder than men. The blow landed against Cole's jaw, sending him staggering into the table. The baby cried again as thunder split the sky. Clara stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, watching the two men crash against the walls of her past. Get out, she cried finally, her voice cutting through the roar of rain. Get out of this house. Cole wiped blood from his mouth, eyes blazing. He looked from her to Eli, both standing firm, both unyielding, and something in him broke. Not with anger, but with shame. He backed toward the door, rain still beating down outside. Didn't come here to fight, he said quietly. Just thought you ought to know the truth. You were wronged, Clara. You always were. He pulled his hat low and stepped into the storm. The wind swallowed him whole. Eli stood for a long moment, chest heaving, fists still clenched. The only sound was the baby's soft sobs and the hiss of rain on the fire. Clara sank to her knees beside the cradle, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was low, hoarse. You believe what he said? She nodded weakly. I don't know what to believe. Only that I'm still here. Eli crouched beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Then that's enough, he said. You're here now. That's all that matters. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder rolled farther away, leaving behind a pale hush, the sound of rain softening the dust. Clara pressed her face into her hands and wept. Not from fear, but from the strange, aching relief of being seen. Not as broken, not as lost, but as someone who had survived. Eli stayed beside her, silent as the dawn that would come, emotional tone and realization, raw tension and reckoning with the past. Clara realizes she's not powerless anymore. Eli learns that protecting someone can be an act of love, even without words. Spring came like a whisper, slow and shy across the plains. The rains that had beaten the land raw now coaxed life from the soil. Tender shoots of grass rose through the mud, and the wind carried the scent of sage and thawed earth. The sky softened, and for the first time in months, Eli Cartwright's ranch no longer looked like a graveyard. Clara Finch stood by the window most mornings, her baby in her arms, watching the world turn green again. The child's laughter came easier now, bright and small against the hum of bees outside. She had color in her cheeks again, a light in her eyes that hadn't been there since the day Eli found her in the grass. Inside the cabin, life settled into a quiet rhythm, one born of work, of small sounds and smaller words. Clara mended shirts by lantern light, her fingers sure and steady. Eli sat by the hearth, sharpening tools, the scrape of steel against stone matching the rhythm of her hums. Soft. Old tunes she said her mother used to sing by the river. Sometimes, when the wind carried her voice through the room, he'd close his eyes and let the sound wash through him like rain through dry soil. There was something new in the air between them, not distance, not yet closeness, but a kind of charged stillness. Every glance lingered a moment too long. Every word spoken carried weight neither of them dared name. They moved around each other carefully, as if both feared that one wrong step might shatter what fragile peace they'd built. One late afternoon, a rider approached from the ridge, broad-shouldered. Wearing a weathered coat and carrying a rifle slung low, Eli stepped outside before the man could dismount. "Jonah," he said, and for the first time in weeks, a smile flickered across his face. The man grinned, his teeth white against his dark beard. "Cartwright. Didn't reckon you'd still be hiding out here in all this quiet." Jonah Gray was an old friend, half Cheyenne, half white, a trapper who moved with the seasons and seemed to belong to the land more than to any side of it. He'd known Eli since they were boys running the riverbanks together before the war. Inside, Clara watched them through the doorway, curiosity bright in her gaze. When Jonah entered, he removed his hat with a courteous nod. "Ma'am," he said warmly. "Didn't know Eli had company, or that the Lord sent him such good fortune." Clara blushed faintly, lowering her eyes. "I'm no fortune, Mr. Gray. Just passing through longer than I planned." Jonah chuckled, pouring himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "Ain't that the way of it? The road decides before we do." As evening fell, the three of them sat by the fire. Jonah told stories of the high country, of rivers that glittered like glass, and of eagles that nested where no man dared climb. His voice carried both worlds in it, the wild and the weary. At one point, he looked between Eli and Clara and smiled knowingly. "You've got a stillness here," he said. "Not the kind that comes from silence, but from care. The land feels it. It's healing," Eli gave a quiet grunt. "Land don't heal easy. Neither do people." Jonah leaned back, watching the flames. "Maybe not. But the earth don't hold grudges. It forgets what we do to it, if we let it breathe. People could learn from that." The cabin fell into thoughtful quiet. Outside, crickets began their slow song, and the smell of rain drifted in through the open window. Later, after Jonah had gone to the barn to sleep, Eli and Clara lingered by the dying fire. Shadows danced along the walls. The baby slept in the cradle, her small breaths rising and falling like the softest tide. Clara stared into the flames. "He speaks of forgiveness as if it were simple," she murmured. Eli turned toward her. "You think it isn't?" She smiled faintly, bitterly. "Forgiveness? No, people remember too well. They twist stories to make the remembering easier." He studied her face, the way the firelight caught the hollow of her cheek, the curve of her braid against her shoulder. "Tell me yours," he said quietly. "The real one." She hesitated, fingers tightening around her shawl. Then, after a long silence, she began. "My husband's name was Thomas," she said. "We came west on promise, land, work, a future. But promises don't hold in dust and hunger. One night the settlement was attacked. A skirmish between settlers and a hunting party that went wrong. Thomas stayed to help defend the wagons, but her voice faltered. He died with a rifle in his hands. And the men who lived needed someone to blame for the loss. They said he'd traded with natives, that he brought it on himself, and me with him. They called it justice." Her eyes shimmered in the half-light. "So they took the land, the wagon, everything. I was left with his name and our child, and nothing else." Eli's jaw worked silently. He reached for a piece of wood, tossed it into the fire, and watched the sparks rise. "My Mary," he said after a time, "died of fever. Winter night. I rode 30 miles for medicine, but by the time I came back she was cold. Never even got to say goodbye. Some things you just carry." Their eyes met, both full of the same quiet ache, different stories. Same shape of loss. Clara whispered, "I'm sorry." "So am I," he said. For a long time, they sat like that, two people joined not by promise but by what they'd both endured. The rain began to fall again, gentle this time, tapping the roof like an old lullaby. Clara broke the silence with a trembling breath. "Do you ever think it's possible to start again?" Eli looked toward the window, where the dark met the light of the fire. "Maybe," he said. "Not the way folks think. You don't start new. You just keep living, and one day it feels less heavy." She smiled faintly, eyes softening. "That sounds enough like starting to me." Eli nodded once, then rose to throw another log on the fire. His hand brushed hers briefly as he passed, the lightest touch, but enough to set the air between them alive again. As he turned away, she looked after him, realizing that what lived beneath this roof wasn't love. Not yet, but something truer. A slow thaw, the first warmth after too long a winter, emotional tone and realization, tender tension and shared confession. They begin to sense that love isn't a promise, but a slow thaw, something that lives quietly beneath the roof they share. By the time summer rolled over the plains, the valley had turned to gold. The grass shimmered like coin under the sun, and the cottonwoods along the creek whispered with every soft wind. Days grew long and full, and the rhythm of work bound Eli and Clara closer than words ever could. They rose before dawn, she to the hearth, he to the corral. The sound of the baby's laughter mingled with the lowing of cattle and the creak of leather. Together they mended fences, branded calves, and hauled water from the well. Sweat and dust marked the days, but so did the unspoken companionship between them, a silent understanding forged not in comfort, but in endurance. Eli watched Clara move through the fields with quiet purpose. Her shawl fluttered behind her like a pale banner, her hair bound in a loose braid. She had strength now, not just in her body, but in the way she met his eyes, steady and unflinching. She smiled sometimes, small and sudden, and those moments made the wide loneliness of the prairie feel less cruel. At night, when the chores were done, they would sit on the porch with mugs of coffee cooling in their hands. The baby slept inside, wrapped in quilts. The horizon glowed faintly with the dying sun. Clara would hum a tune, soft, lilting, and Eli would find himself listening as though it were the only sound left in the world. But peace, he'd learned, never stayed long in this land. It began one evening when the air turned strange, too still, too heavy. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, nostrils flaring. The smell of smoke came first, faint as a ghost. Eli rose from his chair, eyes narrowing toward the barn. Then came the flicker, orange light spilling against the dark. He was running before Clara could speak. The barn door was already alive with flame, crackling loud enough to drown the crickets. Shadows moved behind the fire. Men, shapes he didn't know but understood all the same. Clara clutched her child, heart hammering. The same terror she'd once fled now stood before her again. Fire, men, ruin. She stumbled into the grass, holding her baby tight, the smell of smoke wrapping around them like the memory of every loss she'd ever known. "Eli," she cried. He didn't answer. He was already in the thick of it, swinging a shovel against one of the intruders. The man went down hard, another lunging out of the dark with a torch raised high. Eli met him head-on, the force of the blow sending the torch flying into the dirt. Sparks burst, dancing like angry stars. "Get off this land!" Eli's voice was hoarse, fierce. "Ain't nothing here worth dying for." But the men didn't listen. They'd come not for gain, but vengeance, old names and rumors carried by wind and whiskey. Clara Finch, they said, had debts unpaid and shame unpunished. She watched from the grass, her baby crying against her shoulder, the same patch of earth where Eli had once lifted them out of hunger and despair. It felt like the past had circled back, testing whether mercy could survive twice. Eli swung again, grunting as firelight carved shadows over his face. The blaze roared higher, feeding on dry hay. Heat pressed against his skin, blistering, relentless. When the last of the intruders turned and fled into the night, the barn was already half-eaten by flame. He staggered back, coughing, his arm seared from the elbow down. Clara ran to him, her dress catching cinders as she knelt. "Eli, your arm." He looked down at it, almost indifferent. "Ain't nothing that won't heal." She tore a strip from her skirt and wrapped it tight around the burn, her hands trembling. The smoke stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. The shawl she'd once thought a kindness from pity now hung in tatters, blackened at the edges. She pressed her hand over his. Firm, sure. The fire ate what it wanted. The barn collapsed with a groan, sparks leaping into the dark. And when it was done, silence fell, heavy, holy. Only the sound of the creak and the baby's soft cries filled the air. Clara looked at the ruin, and then back at him. "It's gone," she whispered. Eli followed her gaze. "Things can be rebuilt," he said simply. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on his face. "You could have died," he met her stare. "So could you. So could she." Something unspoken passed between them, the same wordless bond that had grown like roots beneath the dust. She reached up, touched the soot along his jaw, and for a heartbeat neither moved. Then she said softly, "You didn't have to fight for me." "I reckon I did," he answered. "You're here. That's reason enough." Her throat tightened. "Why?" Eli's eyes were dark, unreadable. "'Cause a man can't always save the ones he loves. But sometimes he gets another chance. And he takes it." The words hung between them, trembling like the smoke that still curled above the ashes. Clara looked away, blinking back tears. The firelight had turned her face gold and red, alive with something fierce and tender. She pressed the baby closer, whispering a lullaby, the same one she'd sung through hunger and fear, the same one Eli had heard in the nights between silence and sleep. The child quieted, small fingers curling against her neck. Eli reached out, resting his hand over hers. "You're safe now," he said, voice rough. Clara shook her head faintly. "No one's safe out here." Then after a pause, "But I'm not afraid anymore." He gave a faint nod. "That's enough." Behind them, dawn began to break, pale and hesitant, stretching over the scorched field. The barn was gone, but in its place stood something truer. Fire had taken the ghosts, left only the living. Clara looked at the ruins and saw not loss, but proof that survival could be love's first shape. When Eli turned toward her, she met his gaze fully for the first time. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The wind shifted, carrying away the last threads of smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. Emotional tone and realization, fierce loyalty and rebirth through danger. Fire becomes a symbol of cleansing, burning away guilt and fear, leaving only truth. Weeks passed, and the world began to soften again. The rains came slow and steady, washing the soot from the earth, coaxing green from the charred fields. Wildflowers broke through the blackened soil, fragile, stubborn things that dared to bloom where the fire had once raged. The air smelled of wet cedar and rebirth. Eli Cartwright healed by degrees. His burned arm stiffened in the mornings, the skin tight and red, but he bore it without complaint. Clara saw to his bandages, her hands gentle but sure, her presence steady as sunlight through a cracked window. She worked the ranch alongside him, feeding livestock, mending fences, fixing what could be fixed. The days had a rhythm now, hard but peaceful. The baby, rounder and louder than ever, crawled across the worn floorboards while Clara laughed, a sound Eli hadn't known he'd missed until it filled his home. In the evenings, they sat on the porch in the cool air, watching the horizon turn to amber and rose. The ranch, once a hollow refuge for sorrow, had found its voice again. Yet beneath the quiet, something unfinished lingered. One morning, as the fog lifted from the creek, Clara stood by the hitching post, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The mare was saddled. The baby slept inside. Eli stepped out of the barn and stopped when he saw her. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded slowly. "For a spell. There are things that need settling. My name, my husband's, what's left of it." He didn't move closer, only looked at her. The woman he'd found broken in the grass, now standing tall, eyes clear and strong. "You don't owe anyone nothing," he said. She smiled faintly. "I do. Myself, most of all." Eli took a long breath, his jaw working as if against words he didn't trust. Finally, he reached up and removed his hat, weathered, sweat-stained, shaped by years of sun and wind. He held it out to her. "Take it," he said. She frowned lightly. "Your hat?" He nodded once. "So you know you've got reason to come back." For a heartbeat, she couldn't speak. The gesture, simple, wordless, carried more weight than any promise could. She reached out, fingers brushing his as she took it. "I will," she whispered. "If you'll be here, I ain't going nowhere," Eli said quietly. She gave a small nod, turned, and mounted the horse. The baby stirred as she passed the window, tiny fingers curling in sleep. Clara looked once toward the horizon, then back at him. He stood motionless by the fence, hatless, watching her ride away into the wide gold morning. The road to town was long and rutted. Dust clung to her skirts, the sun pressed heavy on her back. She kept her eyes forward, past the rolling hills and memory-laden trees. When she reached the small settlement, its streets still bore the familiar weight of whispers. Faces that turned too quickly, voices that fell silent when she passed. But this time, Clara didn't lower her head. She walked straight to the magistrate's office, her husband's old letter folded in her hand, proof of his innocence written before the end. The clerk blinked in surprise at her calm. The magistrate, grey and weary, listened as she spoke, not with bitterness but with truth laid bare. "He died trying to keep others alive," she said. "And they called it sin. I won't carry their lies anymore." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then the magistrate nodded, slow and grave. He signed his name at the bottom of a new document, stamped it with a seal, and slid it toward her. "You're clear, Mrs. Finch," he said. "All debts forgiven. All record struck." Her breath caught. She didn't thank him, not out of pride, but because freedom didn't need gratitude. It needed breath, and she finally had it. When she stepped outside, the sunlight was sharper, cleaner. The townsfolk who'd once turned their backs met her eyes now, uncertain, even ashamed. She walked past them with quiet grace, the folded paper pressed against her heart. She stayed one night at the small inn, her baby asleep beside her, listening to the wind against the shutters. In the morning before dawn, she saddled her horse again. The road home waited. The plains opened before her like an old song, familiar and endless. The land shimmered with color now, 1,000 wildflowers nodding in the wind. The baby giggled as they rode, her small hands grasping the edge of Eli's hat that shaded them both. By the time the ranch came into view, dusk was settling, that soft, amber hour when the world seemed caught between breath and stillness. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. The house stood quiet, solid, waiting. Eli was on the porch, rocking slow, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He didn't rise when she approached, only watched, his eyes steady beneath the brim of a new hat, his expression unreadable. Clara dismounted, the baby cradled in her arm. For a moment, she simply stood there, the scent of sage and smoke around her, her heart thudding like hooves in her chest. Then she held out his old hat, worn and dusted from the trail. "Thought I'd return what wasn't mine," she said softly. He took it, turning it in his hands, the edges singed from old sun, the band faintly stained where his sweat had lived. Then, with slow certainty, he set it back on his head. "Guess that means you came home," he said. She smiled, not wide, but deep. "If you'll have me." Eli leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "Reckon this place could use another hand," he murmured. "And a laugh or two." Clara climbed the porch steps. The boards creaked beneath her boots. She sat beside him, the baby reaching out toward the fireflies that blinked in the grass. For a while they said nothing. There was no need. The land was quiet again, but not empty. The ghosts had gone, carried off by wind and rain. What remained was life, raw, imperfect, and real. Clara rested her head against the back of the chair. Eli poured her coffee, his rough hand brushing hers in the passing. The warmth between them was no longer hesitant. It was steady, like the rhythm of the plains, patient, enduring, alive. Somewhere out across the dark, thunder muttered. Not a storm this time, but rain promising growth. Clara looked out toward the fields where flowers trembled in the wind and thought, maybe this is what peace feels like. Not the end of struggle, but its quiet reward. Eli's voice broke the silence, low and certain. World don't give second chances easy. She turned to him, smiling through the glow of dusk. No, she said. But sometimes it gives the right ones. The rocking chair creaked softly. The stars began to rise, and for the first time, the house truly felt like home. Emotional tone and realization. Peace, renewal, and quiet love. The land heals, the heart steadies. They've both learned that salvation isn't found in rescue. It's built, one act of kindness at a time.